power. It's an ambiguous concept. In physics, we talk about power as the transfer of energy, or the potential to transfer energy. The sun has enough power too, for example. And social and political power is thought of in a similar way. The power to stop someone doing something, the power of the police to stop a speeding car. But compared to predictable physical objects, the force of gravity on a rock or the waterfall to generate hydroelectric energy, the way people and institutions wield power upon other people, and how power has an effect on those people, is a difficult concept to understand. French philosopher Michel Foucault, whose thought I've introduced here, had a particularly influential theory of how power operated. It underpins almost all of Foucault's work, but it's also worth looking at in depth for another reason. It's the most frequent criticism of him, that his work is, cynically, all about power. This is true, but the cynicism is misdirected, because although Foucault is interested in the power to, for example, stopping someone doing something, he is more interested in power in a more neutral sense, how power can be productive as well as oppressive, like the waterfall and the rock. To understand this, it's essential to understand how three Foucauldian concepts relate to one another: the subject, power, and knowledge. In the essay Why Study Power? The Question of the Subject, Foucault writes, "My objective has been to create a history of the different modes by which, in our culture, human beings are made subjects." What does he mean by subjects? He has a unique understanding of the subject, of how the human mind is constructed. He says it's become objectified, that is, that it's a subject and an object at the same time. Take the study of the speaking human, Foucault says. It's only in the 19th century that we begin to study human speech as an object, as a science, as something to be understood. We start to study grammar, then philology, linguistics. We start to categorize, measure, compare. The human becomes an object. It becomes written down, quantified, put in boxes, interpreted. Humans as a species become things to be studied themselves. But this objectification then becomes subjectification. This new information has power over us, encourages us to act in certain ways. It subjectifies us. In a very obvious sense, for example, we teach children in schools by the standards dictated by the history of linguistics, or economics based on a very limited and particular understanding of how humans have produced and consumed over the last few centuries. This information becomes authoritative. Many would argue that the way linguistics, as an example, has developed and the reasons we teach children this or that grammar is purely rational, a product of becoming more intelligent as a species. But Foucault says that the word rationalization is dangerous. He writes, what we have to do is analyze specific rationalities rather than always invoke the progress of rationalization in general. Specific rationalities, as if there are more than one. His point is that if there are innumerable different ways of doing something, as exemplified by the thousands of types of language and communication over the world, what justifies doing something one way over the other? His answer is power, that social systems move us to do certain things in certain ways. Between 1970 and 1982, Foucault gave a series of lectures at the Collège de France. One of the more influential in 1978 was Security, Territory and Population, which was published posthumously. In it, he takes biopower as the central concept. He said, "This year I would like to begin studying something that I have called, somewhat vaguely, biopower. By this, I mean a number of phenomena that seem to me to be quite significant, namely, the set of mechanisms through which the basic biological features of the human species became the object of a political strategy, of a general strategy of power. He goes on to argue that our traditional understanding of power is a product of the Enlightenment. Starting in the 17th century, social contract theorists like Hobbes, Locke and Rousseau all discussed the justifications for and limits of government, of why and when rulers should have power over us. Hobbes, for example, argued that the sovereign, the king or the queen, had power because if no one ruled, anarchy would reign. But the type of power these thinkers conceptualized was juridical power. It's the power of law over us, the banning of certain actions, speeding for example, and the threat of violence if the rule is not adhered to. It's the threat of violence that always underpins it. It may not seem like it, but in reality, if you refuse to pay the speeding ticket and you refuse to go to prison, in the end there'll be some kind of violence, the baton or the gun directed against you. But as these Enlightenment philosophers were writing, a new type of power was emerging. The power not of ruling, but of governing too, of managing grain prices, of maximising profit of foreign trade through mercantilism, then slowly of poor relief, education, healthcare, the disciplining of delinquency, the practices of psychiatry, of encouraging certain types of medical knowledge, of planning and executing epidemic control. In all of these cases, a certain type of power is exercised, using certain methods by certain groups of people over others, and importantly, all of this was not the exercising of juridical power, not simply the power of the law, but of what Foucault calls biopower, the power to produce subjects. He argues that this is a type of power that the state in the West has inherited from the Church. It doesn't simply command do or do not, and punish according to that law, but also aims to know people's minds and actions, seeks to direct thought and desire itself.
Fires and other catastrophes are dramatic events which attract wide attention. But we ignore the less spectacular but continuous wastage and erosion of our population. Every day we are tragically wasting our human resources by failure to provide for healthful and effective living. Wastage of human resources occurs at all age levels, but infancy is an especially hazardous period.
Foucault recognises two distinct things happening in amongst all of this. On the one hand, there's simply the relaying of information, the communication of ideas through psychiatric care, for example, or medical knowledge, of moral instruction, of just laws. But there's also something else, the power relations that make the relaying of them, the instruction, the authority, effective. He writes, "The activity which ensures apprenticeship and the acquisition of aptitudes or types of behaviour is developed there by means of a whole ensemble of regulated communications, lessons, questions and answers, orders, exhortations, coded signs of obedience, differentiation marks of the value of each person and of their levels of knowledge, and by the means of a whole series of power processes. Enclosure, surveillance, reward and punishment, the pyramidal hierarchy." He asks, how can we separate the two? How can we understand them distinctly? He says that biopower doesn't have an effect on people physically, necessarily, but on possible future actions, their possibilities and choices. He says this power is an action upon an action. It constrains and encourages. The teacher, for example, has the power to mark a test, assign grades, which employers use to judge potential candidates. The teacher doesn't hold a gun over the student's head, but the student knows that the power that they do have has an effect on their own future choices and possible actions. He writes, faced with a relationship of power, a whole field of responses, reactions, results, and possible inventions may open up. He goes on, It's a total structure of actions brought to bear upon possible actions. It incites, it induces, it seduces, it makes easier or more difficult. In the extreme, it constrains or forbids absolutely. It is, nevertheless, always a way of acting upon an acting subject or acting subjects by virtue of their acting or being capable of action. And finally, to govern in this sense is to structure the possible field of action of others. Juridical power, the power of law, is subtracting. It removes the option to do something, to speed for example, and in a way is repressive. But again, the biopower Foucault describes is productive too. Sometimes institutions like the government, police or the military exert their power by physical, repressive shows of force, crowd control, tear gas, executions, military occupations, but they also exert biopower by way of discipline and training. Again, we think of an action on an action. Handling weapons, driving, flying, schedules, tests, grading, assault courses, police conduct. These are the moments biopower is exerted through the possibility of rewarding or punitive measures, the encouraging or constraining of certain actions. These actions then have an effect on others, citizens for example, and their possible actions, where they go and how they act. Take criminology and its use by governments. There must be checks, supervision, investigation, correction, but also preventative measures. What's the crime rate in a certain area? How can one predict crime and prevent it? To what extent should surveillance of any kind be used? How can we understand the criminal? Is it worth trying to correct? What level of comfort and freedom should be allowed? Are they dangerous? What's optimal? What's the norm, the base rate that we compare all of this to? Foucault writes, discipline classifies the components thus identified according to definite objectives. What are the best actions for achieving a particular result? What's the best movement for loading one's rifle? What's the best position to take? What workers are best suited for a particular task? What children are capable of obtaining a particular result? Ultimately, he says, it reduces to economics. The fundamental question is economics and the economic relation between the cost of repression and the cost of delinquency.
Many spend their time in unhealthy surroundings that foster juvenile delinquency, especially among those who have had an unhappy childhood. This is an inexcusable waste of our most valuable resource. That might do it. The records of our juvenile courts all plainly show how widespread is this tragic waste of youth. This wastage could be prevented by more adequate provision for the basic needs of youth.
All of these modern phenomena of objectifying humans have the effect of creating standards by which humans should be measured, a norm or a normalizing judgment. How good is child X at maths compared to the norm? How much crime is in area Y compared to the norm? How efficient is soldier Z compared to the norm? Which leads Foucault to another point. A norm, a standard, is only possible in reference to a group. And modern governmentality is only possible in reference to a population. All of these practices emerge at the same time as our modern understanding of what a population is. In Security, Territory and Population, Foucault shows that definitions of population used to define the term as repopulating a territory. It had a slightly different meaning to today. In the 17th century, it begins to take on its modern usage. Population becomes important analytically, to study, to understand, to quantify. Because the population of a country provides manpower, economic development, agricultural output, it becomes the source of a state's wealth. Birth, death, sickness and productivity rates become important. Population then, as an aggregate, creates a mean, an average citizen, and a normative curve against which exams, tests and requirements can be assessed. The question can be asked, how can the correct sort of population be encouraged? It's only then with the modern concept of population that we get the modern form of governmentality. He writes, baldly, at first sight and somewhat schematically, we could say that sovereignty is exercised within the borders of a territory, discipline is exercised on the bodies of individuals, and security is exercised over a whole population. We can see then how sovereignty, juridical power, the power of the gun, of the baton, of law, is exercised over a specific territory. This territory has a population, the productivity of which is important to its sovereignty, and then discipline threads all of this together, creating subjects through power and knowledge.
The middle years of life should be the most productive years, on farm, in mill and factory. Yet many are not at work because of accidents, illness, and occupational disease. Millions of productive hours are lost, reducing income for workers and their families, and reducing production for society.
Many have criticised Foucault's understanding of power and its usefulness. Philosopher Charles Taylor concludes that if power, knowledge, and the subject are a result of a particular political or social regime, then there can be no such thing as a truth independent of its regime, unless it could be that of another, so that liberation in the name of truth could only be the substitution of another system of power for this one. And similarly, Nancy Fraser writes that because Foucault has no basis for distinguishing, for example, forms of power that involve domination and those that do not, he appears to endorse a one-sided, wholesale rejection of modernity as such. Clearly, what Foucault needs, and needs desperately, are normative criteria for distinguishing acceptable from unacceptable forms of power. I think these are fair criticisms, but for Foucault this is exactly the point. There are no universal normative criteria for distinguishing acceptable from unacceptable forms of power. What works for one group may not work for others. What's utilitarian for one group may not be for one individual, because the social and political use of power is the product of human goals and desires that are continually shifting and changing. Which is why no universal normative criteria can be established. Foucault writes, one is dealing with mobile and transitory points of resistance, producing cleavages in a society that shift about, fracturing unities and affecting regroupings, furrowing across individuals themselves. Just as the network of power relations ends by forming a dense web that passes through apparatuses and institutions without being exactly localized in them, so too the swarm of points of resistance traverses social stratifications and individual unities. In many ways, Foucault is simply trying to describe social and political power as scientists have done for power in physics, but it is a difficult task, and one that we're only just beginning to try to understand.
If you like these videos, I need your help, and here's my request. If you think you get the same value from 4 of these videos as you do from just 1 cup of coffee, then please consider pledging just $1 per video. That's $3 to $4 per month to keep this channel going. You can even limit your pledge to $1 a month, and if you pledge $5, I'll add your name to the credits. To those that already support then and now, thank you so much. This channel just wouldn't exist without you. You can also hit like, share, follow me on Twitter and Facebook, etc. All of these things really contribute to helping then and now grow. Thanks for watching, and see you next week.